All right, students, this section of Chapter 18 is very long, so I will definitely have to break this into two screencasts. So the very first major battle of the Civil War was the First Battle of Bull Run. And you will notice that there's a General McDowell mentioned, and he was in command of the Union forces, and General P.G.T. Beauregard was in command of the Confederate forces. Now, this took place in Virginia, and remember, Virginia is right close to Maryland. This wasn't very far from Washington, D.C. at all. And people from Washington, D.C. actually got in their carriages and in their wagons and went out to view the battle, which, of course, is not a good idea. They expected that the Union forces would quickly overwhelm these Confederate yahoos, and they could watch this spectacle, and it would be something of a distraction for them. And at first, that's what it looked like was going to happen. But the Confederates turned the tide, and this is where sort of Stonewall Jackson got his reputation. And the rebel forces began driving the Northern forces back. And as that happened, the spectators began getting in their carriages, in their wagons, and running back towards town because they were afraid, obviously. And then the Union forces wanted to get away from the rebel forces who were, shooting at them. And the problem was that they couldn't get away from the rebel forces because there was a traffic jam on the road from all of the spectators who were trying to get back into town. So the very first battle of the Civil War was lost by the North, partly because of all of the idiot spectators that had gone out from Washington, D.C. I'm sure that Lincoln was probably dismayed over the whole thing, not just that his troops lost, but that the civilians were contributing to the loss. All right, let's talk about the fight in the West. For our purposes, the West is the Mississippi River Valley for the Civil War. Remember, this is part of Scott's plan, control the Mississippi River. And they're going to do this to try to divide the South one side from the other. And also, this is going to give the North a transportation route, so that's important. And remember, the South has fewer railroads, so they need any waterways they have to help with transportation. And this battle begins, I'm sorry, my little talking box is covering the date, but this begins in early February in 1862. So it's almost a year since Lincoln has been sworn in when they actually start fighting over there in the Mississippi River Valley. Now, these forces are under the command of General Grant. Now, Grant is not a well-known guy at the time. This is why he's put in command of the forces in the West. Okay, Lincoln thought he had his best guys in command of the forces in the East, over there where General Lee was. It's not that he put bad people in control of the West. It's just that he knew Lee was his biggest problem, and he thought that he had his best guys facing against Lee in the East and could turn other people loose over there by the Mississippi River. But Grant turned out to be one of the best fighters he had. And Grant went about capturing the Mississippi River by working on some of the tributaries. And there were little forts along these tributary rivers, and one of them was the Tennessee. There was Fort Henry on the Tennessee River and Fort Donelson on the Cumberland. And Grant captured these without too much trouble. In fact, by the time he got to Donelson, the people there had offered, said, can we have terms of surrender? And he said, no, there will be no surrender terms. It's unconditional surrender. And he got the nickname of Unconditional Surrender Grant. And he became an instant war hero in the North because, of course, there's newspaper reporters. I mean, this is a war that is covered in the newspapers. It's not it's probably the first war that is widely covered with pictures and newspaper reporters. All right, let's talk about the ironclads for a minute. You need to know what those are because it was an advance in naval technology. And it was an advance on both sides because even before the war started, the U.S. Navy, which of course that includes people from the South, the United States Navy was working on developing this thing. It is the forerunner of a battleship. You can see that by the picture up there in the corner. This slide is a little bit confusing. For your purposes, know that the first ironclad battle became known as the battle between the Monitor and the Merrimac. The Merrimac's official name before it became the Merrimac was the Virginia, but we're going to call it the Merrimac because that's the way it's referred to in most history books. Your book makes a big deal about the fact that it was named the Virginia. However, most history books consider it the Monitor and the Merrimac. So what they did was they would put iron on the outsides of these boats, and at first people thought they wouldn't float. But they did, of course, because there's air inside. But as you can see by the picture, there's not hardly any windows in them. They put cannons on the outside of them, which is somewhat helpful, except the cannonballs will bounce off of them. So they're useful as a tool against conventional boats or as a siege weapon against cities that are on the river. But as far as battling against each other, they're kind of equal because cannonballs won't go through that iron. So my point is, both sides had this thing. The South was the first one to actually launch one of these boats, but the North had them too because the whole U.S. Navy was developing this technology before the war broke out. Okay, a little bit more about ironclads. I don't think you're going to be tested on this heavily. I just have a little bit about them because I think it is a good thing to know that war usually does cause leaps forward in technology, military technology. And this is a good instance of it. These things are very hard to work in because there's almost no windows. These little things that you see here are not windows. These are ports for cannons. So they're very hot inside because, of course, they're steam driven and you have to have heat to make steam. And when the cannons are firing, that makes it hot as well. The water helps to dissipate some of the heat inside, even in the summertime, because the water, has a cooling factor to it. But it's very, very uncomfortable to work in there. So it took a special kind of person with a special kind of determination to work in these ironclads. Okay, let's talk about the Battle of Shiloh. It is an important battle, and it is sort of where Grant really becomes. He was known for his battles at Henry and Donelson, but when he takes on Shiloh, it is a big deal. So the objective, as you can see by the map down here, is he's moving south. He's moving south, south, south. Okay, this is Missouri. This part of the Mississippi River, that's controlled by the Union, but he's trying to go down south. He's trying to get south, south, south. Okay, so he's going to go south to this place called Shiloh, and he faces opposition here because by the time he gets that far south, the Confederates know he's coming. It's not a question of he's not surprising them and he's not overwhelming them at first because they know he's coming, and he faces a considerable resistance at this point. He faces the resistance in the form of Albert Sidney Johnston, and he was an excellent Confederate general, like I told you, and Beauregard was there as well. So it wasn't as easy as Henry and Donelson was. This battle lasted for 2 days, and it was only a narrow Union victory. And as you can see at the bottom, the losses were horrendous for both sides. But when it gets back to Washington, D.C., how many losses the Union has, people begin to worry. I mean, because you're blowing through men at a huge rate, and that's how Grant was. And he goes on with this method of just whatever it costs in men is simply what he's willing to pay to get the victory. But, I mean, if you look at the chart, you have roughly 1,500 people killed, roughly 9,000 people wounded by the Union. So that's a lot of people just in one battle that he's losing. Now, it's equally bad for the Confederates. That's a lot of people. But still, people began to start talking about Grant. They're happy he's winning, but they're unhappy with the price he's paying. Now, I'm going to stop here and then pick up this screencast after the Battle of Shiloh.